Ryan. Online on 95.2 and on digital.
BBC Radio Oxford.
Radio for Oxfordshire.
Very delighted and very prestigious company that Alyn Shipton has dropped in. Good evening, Alan. How are you?
I'm fine, Al. Yeah, it's been a great weekend.
Good stuff. I know you've been busy around the place working on a new project, but you can tell us all about that in a few minutes. But you're here mainly to talk about singer-songwriter Harry Nilsson and the new biography that you've brought out called Singer-Songwriter, isn't that what it's called?
Yeah, Nilsson, The Life of a Singer-Songwriter.
The award-winning book, I should say, which picked up a prestigious Deems Taylor Award as well.
It did, yeah. It got that award from ASCAP in the States, which is quite fun. And then I got another award in the States for Best Research in Pop Music of the Year. So that was good to have.
Good heavens, you'll be up there with Dan Morgenstern next with Grammy Awards and things like that. But we'll get into that in a minute because it's a slight departure for you writing about singer-songwriters. You know, we're so used to when a book comes out by Alyn Shipton, it's usually jazz-related. It's either Dizzy Gillespie or it's Fats Waller or, as I said, George Shearing and things like that. And most recently, Chris Barber. But Harry Nilsson, how did that happen?
Well, that comes back to radio again, actually. I was in Los Angeles making a series with Richard Perry, who was one of the great record producers of all time. Richard and I did bond over jazz. He actually produced Ella Fitzgerald, and he produced Fats Domino, and made a number of great albums with them. But in working on his career for a Radio 2 series that went out a few years ago, I discovered that he'd produced two great albums with Harry Nilsson. I said to Richard, I really love Nilsson Schmilsson and Son of Schmilsson. Where can I find out more about Harry? And he said, you can't. Yeah. And I said, why not? Isn't there a book? And he said, no. And it's unlikely there will be because the Nilsson family they were very distraught when he died in the early 1990s. And all his papers just got locked away and nobody's looked at them. Yeah,
extraordinary. I mean, he's the sort of fellow that you thought, well, there'd be at least 3 or 4 volumes about Harry Nilsson because he was such a tearaway kind of a character.
Well, he was a tearaway. He was a household name. He had 2 enormous hits, both Grammy-winning songs, and he was somebody who was very much part of the consciousness of the Beatles era. I mean, he was named by the Beatles as their favourite singer and their favourite group. So, I mean, he was somebody who very much was part of that era. His first album from the late 1960s, right the way through the 70s, he was making albums. And I think you couldn't avoid hearing Harry on Radio 2, seeing him on BBC television.
On the telly, yeah.
And so he was very much a figure in that era. And yet, there's this kind of almost complete silence. A few reference books have a short article about his life. Most of them were wrong, as I discovered. And so I had to start digging. And through the good offices of Richard, I made contact with the family and with the lawyers who looked after all that material. And eventually we got to an agreement that they would release the papers to me and I'd be able to research his life. And this is, of course, the great thing for a biographer, is being able to delve a little bit more deeply. And in some cases, like Dizzy didn't write letters. So when I was doing Dizzy Gillespie's life, there was no documentary stuff to research. But with Harry there was, and he'd started an autobiography. He was a great letter writer. He was somebody who, particularly when he was campaigning against gun control in the States.
Yes, this was a big thing. Yeah.
He wrote loads and loads of letters. So there's a kind of day-to-day picture of his life that emerges. Yeah. And that's the biographer's food and drink. I mean, you have to have that, really, to get into somebody's life.
So you were able to delve into that. As I say, you had, unparalleled access to his personal notes and things like that.
I did, and felt I came to know him much better than one would have done just by reading third-party accounts or interviewing his friends and so on, because there is Harry's own writing, his own voice telling his story, because there were 2 autobiographies. There was a taped one, which was very full, but hadn't actually been transcribed until a great American filmmaker, John Scheinfeld, made a film about him for television.
Oh, yes, I think I saw that.
Who is Harry Nilsson and why is everybody talking about him? It's a great film. And John and I started working together. I mean, the last stages of the film and my research overlapped. And I was lucky enough to see the final cut of the film as John was working on it. And he discovered this oral autobiography. Meanwhile, I'd got hold of the printed one, which was something that Harry had typed up and actually worked on to finesse a bit. So I had both Harry's last word in. I mean, he'd literally been putting changes on that manuscript the night before he died.
Good heavens.
And then the longer version that never got printed.
It's absolutely extraordinary that the way things come about, because, as I say, at the height of his commercial success in the early 70s, I mean, he's best known, I suppose, for Everybody's Talking from Midnight Cowboy, Without You, and Coconut, I suppose, are the three big ones, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks to Reservoir Dogs, we all know about Coconut. But the other two were both #1 hits in their day, both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, the great thing about Without You, for me, was that the day that the contract arrived, saying that the Nilsson estate had granted me access and everything else, the postman came, the thing came through the letterbox, I opened the letter, and there on Radio 2 was
Without You. A good omen by all accounts.
Very much so. And actually, I got much more into the music. And one of the things you have to do, obviously, if you're writing about somebody, is you try and find every scrap of music that's going. Now, at that stage, you couldn't. There was a lot of Harry's music that had just fallen out of the public domain, and some things that those of us who started to get keen on bootlegging discovered, but which was certainly not publicly available.
Yeah.
But very fortunately, again through the good offices of the Nilsson estate and his wonderful widow, Una, who has been an absolute tower of strength to me in trying to get the book written, we were able to work, as I was working on the book, with RCA Records to pull together the comprehensive collection of Harry's work for that label, and that is really the core of his work.
Yeah. So this was kind of a companion to the book, really, which was a 17 CD.
It was, and amongst the things in there, and we might come to those a bit later on, are some of the demos that Harry made.
Yeah.
There's a great Italian version of Without You, because apparently he topped the charts in Italy singing that song in Italian. It's not quite got the same poignancy as the one we've just heard, but nonetheless, he did do that. And there's a lot of other extraordinary things, including one of the very few occasions when he actually sang as opposed to lip-synced on television or radio, when he appeared with Brian Matthew on Saturday Club. And in those days, the BBC had a restriction on needle time, so Harry actually had to come in and sing the song because they couldn't play the record. And the BBC arrangers had taken down every note of the arrangement from the States.
Yeah.
And so it was just like for Harry singing the record, except it was done live in the studio.
Because he didn't like performing live, he didn't tour extensively, he didn't do anything like that. He couldn't cope with it, or just he didn't
didn't want to. And I think one of the reasons he decided very early in his career that he wasn't going to do this was that he met the Beatles. And the Beatles are great fans of his, but he was also a great fan of theirs. And quite early on, after he made his first couple of albums, he flew over to England. He was working on a film called Skidoo for Otto Preminger, one of the worst films ever made, apart from Harry's wonderful score.
Yeah.
Jackie Gleason is the eminently forgettable rogue along with Mickey Rooney. It's a terrible film, but the music's great. And in the middle of filming, Preminger gave him a couple of days off because he kind of hinted that he might be able to get the Beatles to record a number for the soundtrack. Well, actually, he had no intention of doing that at all.
Yeah.
But Derek Taylor, the Beatles publicist, was a great Harry fan, and he got him over during the time they were making the White Album. So he came to London, and he was absolutely horrified by the fact that their lives weren't their own.
Yeah.
I mean, John Lennon being mobbed as he got out of his limousine in London, Paul McCartney driving him around London at night so that he wouldn't be recognised.
Yeah.
It was something that hadn't really come home to Harry, and I think he decided that if he never appeared on stage, okay, he made a few television films, he appears in one or two interviews, he made a couple of guest starring roles in television sitcoms, but otherwise he was a not known face.
Yeah.
And on every album, his appearance changes. So he could walk down the street in Los Angeles, go to the shops, put a bet on, have a drink in a bar, and nobody recognised him. And that's just the way he liked it.
My guest this evening on Drive Time here on BBC Radio Oxford is Oxfordshire-based writer and broadcaster Alyn Shipton, and we're chatting about his biography about Harry Nilsson. And there's an interesting story about that version of Everybody's Talking.
Yeah, well, it wasn't originally going to be in the film. The idea was that John Schlesinger actually asked a number of people, including Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell, to come up with title music. And quite by chance, Derek Taylor said, "Why don't you ask Harry Nilsson?"
Yeah.
And Schlesinger said, "Harry who?" As a lot of people said to me when I was writing the book. And apparently what happened was that Derek Taylor said, "Well, you want to take a listen to this song because maybe it's something like this that you want."
Yeah.
So Harry actually wrote another song called I Guess the Lord Must Be in New York City, which sounds very like Everybody's Talking.
It does. And it's again, it would be one of my favourite Nilssons.
It's a terrific song, but actually what happened was, as they were making the movie, they used Everybody's Talking as a placing track to get all the title sequences cut together. So as the thing was being made, they started using this song, and you've got all the stuff at the beginning with John Voight looking forward to his trip to New York. It's always quite ironic that he's going where the sun don't shine. Actually, it's a slightly different climate which he's setting off to from sunny Texas, but it still became so close to the spirit of the film that in the end, John Schlesinger said, well, we'll keep it. We'll use this song. And so Harry didn't have to record another song for the opening titles, although if you do see the film, everybody's talking lasts nearly 8 minutes at the beginning of the film.
It's a recut version of it.
Well, it was a re-recorded version, actually. And that wonderful arrangement by George Tipton of Fred Neil's song is used as the basis of it. And then John Barry, who scored the movie, used George Tipton's wonderful arrangement as the basis for the rest of the film.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, about had John Barry had a hand in it, but no, it was
the other way around.
Tipton. Yeah, it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But I mean, he's such an extraordinary character, and you think of him running around with the Beatles, with John Lennon and things like that. And then there's that story about him kind of completely blowing his pipes out with John Lennon on a complete binge they go on.
Well, they were making an album called Pussycats, and they did it in Los Angeles. It's during what was known as John Lennon's long weekend, when he spent 2.5 years away from Yoko Ono in the West Coast with his then girlfriend May Pang. And I have to say, May was fantastically helpful to me in writing the book. Gave me a lot of real insights, and she was one of the few, along with Klaus Fuhrmann, the bassist, one of the few people who was there in the beach house that they all rented. And the stories of debauchery in that house, I mean, nobody could really stand before noon. I guess that had something to do with the fact that Keith Moon was also staying there, the drummer with The Who. And
to be a fly on the wall there.
It would have been quite something. So Harry took part in a number of late-night drinking and singing sessions and basically ruined his voice. So there he was, contracted to make this album. In fact, almost not contracted, because his RCA contract ran out while he was making this album, produced by John Lennon. And there suddenly the singing star has no voice. So that was quite remarkable. And in folklore, most of the books, most of the magazine articles, most of the dictionary articles about Nilsson say that after that his voice never came back. But that's not really the case. He did get it back. In fact, the vocals on the album were made again in New York, and they cut them in slightly better than it would have been when his voice was at rock bottom. But then he didn't ever record for Richard Perry again, except on other people's albums. And he's one of the backing vocalists on Carly Simon's You're So Vain. And he's also the backing vocalist on Ringo's You're 16.
Really?
Where he is every other voice. Is here Ringo singing the main tune. But every other voice on that record is Harry Nilsson.
And Ringo is back again, isn't he?
New album from Ringo, and a great interview actually on the Today programme this week, saying that he's not going to write his autobiography, he's going to sing it instead. And the new album is apparently part of that. And I must say, the bits I've heard are really fantastic, and it's wonderful that one of the Beatles, along with Paul McCartney, of course, still performing, but that Ringo is still making new music and still feels compelled to do it.
It's fantastic that these guys are still doing it. Now, one of the things that you came across, or one of the things that come out of writing this book, is besides the reissue of this issue of 17 CDs by RCA Victor, is the reissue and the first time on CD of Flash Harry, which hasn't seen the light of day since about 1970 on vinyl here in the
much
UK.
later than that, 1987. It's one of the last albums. I beg your pardon, no, 1980. One of the last albums that Harry made, and he made it for Mercury in this country, so it came out in the UK, but was never issued in the States at all. It was only ever on LP in Britain and in Japan. And finally, it's come out now in CD worldwide.
Good heavens.
But the album is slightly extraordinary because it's it is in fact the only Harry Nilsson album that has a track on it in which Harry himself doesn't appear at all.
Isn't that funny? I mean, why is that, or how did that happen?
That happened because he was a fantastic fan of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Harry and Graham Chapman were great mates. I mean, not surprisingly, they both shared an appetite for booze and other substances, and met whenever Harry was in London. Harry had a flat in London for a long time, and he was in a kind of drinking club with Ringo and Graham Chapman. So when the Monty Python stage show went to the States for the first time, Harry was there. He actually played a Mountie singing the Lumberjack song in New York. Unfortunately, he'd had rather a lot of brandy, and as the curtain came down, he fell off the stage into the audience and broke his arm. But he was very much a member of the Python team, and I've talked to both Michael Palin and Eric Idle, and in fact, very recently here in Oxford, Terry Jones, about their time with Harry Nilsson as an extra member. Anyway, Eric was very taken by the fact that Harry wanted to record Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Now, bear in mind, the Monty Python crew are used to BBC budgets. Here we are sitting in this lavish studio with our canapes and champagne around us.
Yeah.
BBC budgets back in the 60s weren't quite so lavish, and they reckoned if they had to record a number like that, they did it in 3 hours flat.
That was it, in and out.
Harry took a month to record Always Look on the Bright Side of Life with the symphony orchestra, all his mates coming in and out of the studio, members of the Wrecking Crew coming up from Nashville and recording just a few lines of bass. Donald Duck Dunn is on it, all those guys. And Eric was so amused by Harry's enormous budget for this one tiny track that he actually wrote a song about Harry. And when Harry was making the soundtrack for the Robert Altman film Popeye, Eric sent him this as a 45. He had it pressed especially and sent it to him. And it's a complete taking the mickey out of Harry and how he wrote his songs.
Alan, thanks so much. We could talk for the night about Harry Nilsson and music and other matters. Don't forget, if you want to pick up the book, it's called Nilsson, The Life of a Singer-Songwriter by Alyn Shipton, published by Oxford University Press, currently in hardback. Paperback version is out in May, isn't that right, Alan?
In May in the States. It'll be a bit later here, but it's coming out in the United States in May.
Fantastic. Listen, continued success to you, my friend, and we'll look forward to any further publications coming about.
Al Ryan, online on 95.2 and on digital.
BBC Radio Oxford.
Radio for Oxfordshire.